Ray reached for a paper towel, drying them as he glanced once at his reflection, then dropped it into the bin. He turned toward the door. It opened as he reached it. Someone stepped in. They ended up directly in front of each other, close enough that neither moved right away. The door shifted behind them as someone pushed through, then settled. The other person looked at him. Ray held it. Neither stepped aside at first. This is where nights don't end. Chapter 2. The Center Table. Ray stood just off the set, checking the monitor as the last frame settled into place, while the model adjusted his sleeves under the light. "Hold that," Ray said, lifting the camera again, without stepping forward, then taking 2 more shots before lowering it. The stylist moved in to fix the collar, and Ray watched through the screen for a second longer before turning slightly toward the table behind him. "Let's reset once," he said, setting the camera down and reaching for his phone without looking at it right away. Someone asked a question about the next look, and Ray answered while unlocking the screen, glancing up once to check the model's position before typing. "You free this weekend? Saturday?" He sent it without reading, then placed the phone face down beside the monitor as the stylist stepped back. Ray picked up the camera up again, adjusting the angle with a small shift of his wrist before shooting through the next sequence without speaking. The shots landed cleanly, and he lowered the camera. "Good," Ray said, stepping back. His phone buzzed once against the table. Ray reached for it as someone walked past, brushing his shoulder lightly, and glanced at the screen. "Saturday works." Ray read it once, then typed a short reply. "Let's do noon." He set the phone down again. A message thread lit up below it before the screen dimmed. "Last week was a mess. Too many people." Ray picked up the phone up again. Another message came in. "It was fine. Keep the same." Ray's thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second, then moved away without typing. He locked the screen and placed the phone back down, turning toward the set as the next look came in. "Let's go," he said, lifting the camera again as the room shifted back into place around him. Sungil stood at the edge of the mat, arms crossed as he watched the line reset in front of him, while one of the younger students adjusted his stance. "Feet," Sungil said, stepping forward and tapping the outside of the boy's ankle with his foot, then shifting it into place before stepping back. The boy followed the correction, lifting his guard a second later as Sungil nodded once. Again, the group moved together, a row of kicks landing out of sync before Sungil raised a hand to stop them. "Not like that," he said, walking down the line and catching one student lightly at the shoulder to turn his body. "You're leaning." He demonstrated once, slow and controlled. They moved again, tighter this time. Sungil watched without speaking, his eyes moving from one to the next as he adjusted 2 more positions with quick, precise touches before stepping out of the line. A phone buzzed against the bench behind him. Sungil glanced over, then walked past it without picking it up, as one of the older students missed the timing. "Reset," he said, clapping once. They shifted back into place. Sungil stepped back, scanning the line once more as they moved through the sequence again. The phone buzzed a second time. Sungil held the line a second longer, then stepped away and walked to the bench, picking up his phone as he wiped his hands on a towel. He unlocked it and opened the message thread near the top. "Do you want to meet again this week? See you Saturday." His thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second before moving away. Another student called out from the mat. "Coach?" Sungil locked the screen and set the phone down, turning back immediately. He stepped in, repositioning the student's stance with both hands, then straightened and looked across the group. "Line up," he said, clapping once. From the top. They moved through the sequence again. Sungil walked the line, adjusting shoulders, correcting balance. The rhythm tightened. Ray slowed near the railing, pulling one earbud out as he came to a stop. His breathing stilled uneven, while he rested his hands briefly on his hips. He straightened after a second and checked his watch, tapping the screen once before looking up. Do-yoon stood a few steps away, already facing him. His gaze moved once over Ray, running shoes, damp shirt, then settled. I thought this was lunch, Do-yoon said. Ray glanced down at himself, then back up. Sorry, been busy all week. I had to run. Do-yoon nodded once. It's fine. You want to grab coffee? Ray asked. Do-yoon gave a small nod. There's a place I like, he said, turning toward the path. Ray fell into step beside him. They walked without adjusting pace. Do-yoon slightly ahead for a step before matching him. You shoot this week? Do-yoon asked. Yep, Ray said. Quite busy, huh? Ray shrugged lightly. The cafe sat just off the main path, narrow entrance with a few tables outside. Do-yoon stepped in first, holding the door just long enough before letting it fall close behind them. They moved up to the counter. What do you want? Do-yoon asked. Black, Do-yoon ordered, then stepped aside as they waited. Ray leaned lightly against the counter. The gang is out tonight, Ray said. Itaewon. Do-yoon held his gaze for a second, then glanced briefly down again. Shoes, shirt, before looking back up. You're gonna change, right? Yeah, I'll come by, he said. Ray nodded once. Their drinks were set down between them. Do-yoon picked his up first and turned toward the seating area. Ray took his and followed. They chose a table near the window. Do-yoon sat first. Ray pulled a chair out and sat across from him, setting his cup down before leaning back slightly. Do-yoon took a sip, then lowered the cup. You usually run in the morning? He asked. Whenever I can, Ray said. Do-yoon nodded once, his attention staying there. Ray lifted his cup, taking a sip before setting it back down, his hand remaining around it. Do-yoon held his gaze a moment longer. You usually keep a set schedule? He asked. Not really, just whenever fits. And the runs? When I have time. The cup set between them had finished. Do-yoon reached for his. You should shower, he said. Ray looked at him. Do-yoon leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the table. I'll come join for the run next time. You can show me the route. Ray smiled. Yeah. The crowd gathered outside, but Jiho didn't slow. He stepped past the rope as it lifted before he reached it, moving through without stopping. Sungil followed close behind. Ray came in last, the door closing behind him as the sound tightened, and the room opened in front of him. Jiho was already inside, pulled into a group near the center, one hand resting briefly at someone's shoulder as he leaned in to speak. Sungil didn't stop when someone reached for him. A hand caught his arm as he stepped in, and he pulled free with a quick smile, nodding once without slowing. Daniel sat where the space opened, one arm resting along the back of his chair. Sungil stepped in beside him, his hand landing briefly at Daniel's shoulder as he leaned in to speak. Daniel turned slightly to hear him, then answered without shifting his position. Sungil stayed there. He didn't turn when someone called his name again from behind. Ray stopped at the bar. He rested his hand against the counter, waiting as the bartender moved down the line. Lucas stood a few steps away, finishing his drink before stepping over, stopping beside him without looking for space. Ray glanced at him. The bartender stepped in. What can I get you? Whiskey, Ray said. The bartender nodded and moved off. Ray leaned his elbow against the counter, his body angled slightly toward Lucas. How have you been? Ray asked. Lucas looked out toward the room, then back, same as the last time. The drinks were set down in front of them. Ray picked his up first. Lucas did the same. At the table, Sungil leaned in again, his hand resting briefly at the back of Daniel's chair. As he spoke, his attention fixed there. Daniel answered, his posture unchanged, his voice low as the conversation stayed between them. Jiho stepped away from the group he was in. He crossed the space, slowing for a moment as his gaze landed on the bar. Ray and Lucas stood side by side, glasses in hand, neither leaning in, neither pulling away. Jiho watched it for a second, then turned his head as someone called him from the opposite side. He changed direction immediately. Ray lifted his glass again, taking another sip. Lucas rested his hand near the edge of the counter. They stayed where they were as the room filled in around them, the table holding behind them, while the music pressed louder. Ray kept his place at the bar, his glass set just in front of him as he watched the room once before settling again. Lucas stood beside him, one hand resting near the edge of the counter, his drink untouched for a moment. A group shifted behind them, someone reaching across the bar before moving away, the space opening again. Ray turned slightly. "So, you're here for a holiday?" Lucas shook his head once. "I live here. Sorry, I thought you were traveling." "I'm half Korean, half Australian." Ray glanced at him, then nodded again. "You come out much?" Lucas shook his head once. "Not really." Ray nodded. The music pushed louder as more people moved in, the space tightening around them before opening again as someone stepped away. At the table, Sungil leaned closer to Daniel, his hand catching Daniel's wrist briefly as he spoke, then releasing it as Daniel answered without changing position. Lucas followed the movement for a second, then spoke. "Looks like he found someone." Ray watched it for a second, then lifted his glass. "Maybe." He didn't look back toward the table again. The door opened again, letting in a brief cut of outside noise before it closed. Do-yoon moved through the room without stopping, his pace steady as he passed one group and then another, his attention fixed ahead. He reached the bar and stopped just behind Ray. "You got here first." Ray turned, meeting him without stepping back. "Yeah." Do-yoon nodded once, then looked toward the counter. "What are you having?" "Whiskey." Do-yoon gave a small nod. "I'll go for same." The bartender stepped in and set another glass down in front of him, before moving away. Do-yoon picked it up, taking a short sip before lowering it. Lucas stayed where he was. Do-yoon glanced at him once, then back to Ray. Jiho stepped out from the group he had been in, moving toward the bar. He slowed as his gaze landed on the three of them. He watched it for a second, then stepped in. "Come," Jiho said, already turning. Ray pushed off the counter first. Do-yoon followed without hesitation. Lucas picked his glass up and moved with them. Jiho reached the table and pulled a chair back with his foot, setting the space as he moved. "Everyone sit," he said. Ray took the seat between Lucas and Do-yoon. Lucas sat on one side, placing his glass down without adjusting closer. Do-yoon took the other, turning slightly toward Ray as he settled. Sungil stayed close to Daniel, shifting just enough to hold his place beside him, his attention still fixed there. Daniel turned slightly to hear him. Jiho remained standing for a moment, looking over the table. Someone called his name from across the room. Jiho didn't turn. He pulled the chair back and sat, his attention settling on the table as the space around them continued to move. Do-yoon leaned in slightly, his attention already on Ray. "You busy tomorrow?" "I have a shoot." Do-yoon held his gaze. "We can meet after." Ray looked at him. "Maybe." Do-yoon nodded once, accepting it. On Ray's other side, Lucas picked his glass up and took a slow drink, setting it back down in the same place. Ray glanced once toward him, then back to Do-yoon. Jiho watched from his seat, his gaze moving across the table once before he leaned back slightly. "Lucas," he called. Lucas turned his head. Jiho lifted his glass slightly. "Come. You feel lucky today?" Lucas looked at him for a second, then nodded once. "Yeah." Jiho's mouth curved slightly. "Do you see anyone interesting?" "Maybe." He pushed his chair back and stood. Ray watched the movement without turning his body, his gaze following just long enough before returning. Do-yoon was still speaking. Ray answered. Jiho and Lucas moved into the crowd, disappearing into the shifting space as the table held its shape. Jiho moved through the crowd without slowing, one hand brushing past the shoulder as he stepped into another group, already mid-conversation by the time Lucas stopped beside him. Lucas stayed a step behind, glass in hand. Jiho leaned in, said something quick, then shifted as another voice reached him from the side. A hand caught his arm. Jiho turned. The guy was already close, speaking near his ear. Jiho listened just long enough, then stepped back. He was already turning before the guy answered. Lucas watched without moving. Jiho reached for his glass, took a short drink, then set it down again as his gaze moved across the room. Lucas followed for a step, then stopped, letting him move ahead. Jiho slowed as he approached, his attention settling on someone at the edge. "Hey," Jiho said, leaning in just enough to be heard. The guy turned. Jiho held his gaze a second, then smiled once. "Stay with me," Jiho said. The guy didn't move away. Jiho turned his head once, checking the room behind him. Table still in place. Ray sitting next to Do-yoon, Sungil still close to Daniel. He looked back. Lucas wasn't there anymore. Jiho didn't search for him. The table settled for a moment as the music carried over them, the conversation thinning without breaking completely. Daniel turned fully toward Sungil, closing the space himself this time, his knee angling in, his shoulder brushing lightly against Sungil's arm as he spoke. "Stay with me tonight. My place." Sungil didn't answer right away. He let the words sit, his expression steady, his hand still where it was as if nothing had shifted. He glanced once at Daniel's glass. "Still full," Sungil said. Daniel picked it up, took a short drink without looking away. Daniel leaned in again, closer this time, his voice lower. "You coming or not? You're in a hurry." Daniel didn't answer. He stayed close. Sungil held his gaze, then leaned in again, speaking near his ear this time. "Finish your drink." Daniel nodded once and drank. Jiho stepped back into the table, the guy from earlier close at his side. At the side of the table, Daniel was already turning away, one hand reaching for his jacket. Sungil stood close behind him, his hand brushing briefly at Daniel's back as he shifted. Jiho glanced between them, then back. "Going before me," Jiho said. Sungil looked at him. Jiho's mouth curved slightly. Sungil gave a small nod, already in motion. Daniel stepped away first. Sungil followed without hesitation. They didn't look back. Ray watched the movement, then turned slightly. Do-yoon was still beside him, his posture unchanged, his glass resting near his hand. "I'll be back," Ray said. Do-yoon nodded once. Ray stood, stepping away from the table. Jiho stayed where he was, the seat across now empty, the room moving around them as the table thinned. Ray stepped back from the urinal and moved to the sink, turning the tap on and running his hands under the water. He reached for a paper towel, drying them as he looked briefly at his reflection, then dropped it into the bin. He turned toward the door. It opened as he reached for it. Lucas stepped in. Ray paused. The space tightened as someone pushed him behind Lucas, the door swinging wider before catching. Ray shifted slightly to the side. Lucas did the same. For a second they were close, shoulders nearly touching. The door held between them. Lucas moved first, heading straight toward the urinals. Ray stayed where he was for a moment longer. Then he stepped out into the hall. The table filled, then cleared again. Jiho decided when it started and when it ended, pulling people in, letting them go without staying himself. Sungil kept what was in front of him, holding it long enough before stepping away on his own terms. Ray didn't move right away. His gaze followed them as they stepped out, then shifted back to the table, stopping briefly before returning to the glass in front of him. Nothing needed to be said. The night settled on its own. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End. Stay with us for the next chapter, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more stories on gay audiobooks. I would also like to say, my Substack page is now open. You'll see the link in the description. This is my cozy, no paywall corner of the internet. Join in for free. I'll update what's behind the stories there. On YouTube, membership is now open behind the closed door. It's a paid space with early access to stories before they are released. Thank you.